talk about is modules. Now, modules is a slightly overloaded term in the context of Angular because what am I talking about when I say module? Well, you have two flavors of a module within Angular, and they do slightly different things. So at a language level, we're talking about ES6 modules. And so we use this to provide organization at the language level. And all this does is provides a container for us to export one thing so that we can import it into another. So in this case, you can see here that we are importing component on init as well as like an item service and an item. So this is a way for us to kind of package things up at a language level. So when it's compiled, it's available and it knows where to find it and then make that available. So you can see here, we're importing essentially ES6 modules that have been exported for consumption. Now, when I say module, I could be talking about ng module. And this provides organization at a framework level. And so this allows us to tell Angular how to configure itself so that it knows what exists and how it needs to fit together. And so we use declarations to define anything that basically the user is going to see. So if you have a component, you declare that. Import, so if you need to import another ng module. Providers, if you need to export something to make it available, as well as in your top level module, you have a bootstrap property that you define the top level component that's going to be bootstrapped. So what this looks like is essentially a object that just has I think of it as a manifest that here's what we want to import. So these are the modules we're importing. Here's the components that we're declaring. Here's the providers that we want to consume. And then we're going to bootstrap on the app component. And then from here, at the very highest level when we're spinning this up, then we're telling Angular to go ahead and bootstrap the app module. And so Angular is organized in this hierarchical kind of tree-shaped component hierarchy in that you have like your top, like your root module, which is like the entry point, and then everything else kind of sits under that. And what this allows us to do, and I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but I can't help myself, is that by having this tree-shaped hierarchy, is that it works really well for unidirectional data flow, that you can have something defined at the top, and then it just kind of flows down the tree, and then if something happens, that event is then propagated back up the tree. So we can think of modules as really nothing more than a logical grouping or a division mechanism to divide and segment pieces of our application. So I currently am in the Phoenix metro area, and when I picked up John from the airport yesterday, we drove through approximately, I want to say 5 or 6 kind of towns that exist within Phoenix Metro. So I think of, when you look at like a topology of, let's say, Phoenix or even Minneapolis or these different, these metro areas, metropolitan areas, is that they are segmented into these smaller kind of independent towns that are all connected. And so if those are modules, then routes would be essentially the streets or the highways, the byways, and so on, that allows us to move or navigate from one module to the other. And this is, in its simplest form, you are simply defining a path for the URL that is then, once that pattern has been, or that path has been matched via pattern matching, then it pulls in and says, I'm going to load this component as a result of that. So if I go to a courses route, then we can define the courses component that gets loaded into the router outlet. So they're loaded into a router outlet, and then we have a very convenient mechanism called router link that we can use then to navigate to other routes. This is something I don't think about a lot, but it is, especially with single page applications, it's relevant that the router uses history.pushState which means that when you generate an application, there's a base ref tag in the index.html that says like, this is the root. And typically I don't touch it, it's just there, it works, but this allows you to essentially use like the back button and the forward button and navigate between the routes, which at one point, believe it or not, was a problem with single page applications, is that you are not actually leaving a page. And so how do we actually create kind of canonical URLs to link into certain parts of it? Where I've used this is I have had an Angular application that was hosted at a subdirectory that was not the root of the domain. And so we had to go in and just update that to say, hey, we're not at /root, we're actually in this directory over here, as not to kind of mess everything up. And so this is what a routing table looks like. It's just an array of route objects, or so it's an array of route objects that has a path and a component. And there's a few other things you can do in here. One, can activate. So let's say you want to protect certain routes, is that you can use can activate that will call a guard, which we'll look at later, that based on some kind of predetermined logic, it'll just say true or false. Can you stay? Can you go? If you go, there'll be trouble. But if you stay, there's going to be double. And so you can essentially guard your routes using a simple function that returns true or false. If true, you can go. If false, you're out. Or the other thing you can do is lazy load a module. And so you can say, I want to go to this route, but I'm going to load in a module that then contains components, and we're going to do it that way. So what this does is it reduces kind of the initial load to where you might load one module up front and then individual modules as you navigate through the application. And then last but not least, you'll see that we have a wildcard here at the bottom, and that's just, it's saying path, it's the double asterisk. So it's saying if we match these or nothing matches, go ahead and just redirect this back to home. Now, this is a pro tip. I don't have this in the slides, but I have been bit by this. And so even if I'm in a hurry, sometimes I will mess this up. But the routing table is evaluated from top to bottom. And so there's a reason why you want your wildcard at the bottom and not at the top. So I've had it where I've had a very general route in front of a very specific route, and I'm like, why can't I navigate to this thing? Well, it's because I was firing a route previous to that. So the order that you declare your routes in the routing table or that array does matter. And so it's as simple as like, oh, okay, I just need to move this up. And so if you're trying to navigate to like a sub-route with like a parameter, that is something to just keep in mind. And you can see here that we're just using router link to link to link.path, whatever that is on this object. And there's even a trigger to say, are we on this active link? And if it is, and so it's just detecting like what route are we on? And if it's active, attach this active class. So this is really nice when you want to attach a specific style to, let's say, a button to indicate that this is the current place that you are in the application. And then at the bottom, you have your router outlet. And so this is where Angular is dynamically saying we have a route match. Let's take this component and put it in here. So the question is what would be the point of having like an active state? And this is typically for if you want to style, you want to attach like a CSS class to, let's say you have a row of buttons, like let's say home, courses, users, whatever. And if you're on the courses route, you want to indicate like this is the currently selected route. And so you might want to like maybe make that button just like a little bit darker, or possibly even disable it. So all it's doing is it's just detecting if this is matched to the route that's defined by the router link, we're going to go ahead and attach whatever class you define for it. And so this is where, again, for stylistic reasons, you might want to just visually style that a little bit differently. So the question is, why do you need to import modules twice, I believe? So one for ES6 and one for ng module. And the distinction I want to make there is that you're using ES6 at the language level. So when you're writing your code and it compiles, that by using TypeScript and ES6, this is how the compiler knows that these things go together and this is available. So this is, ES6 modules are purely for compilation and language level purposes. On the other hand, ng modules, which are not at the language level, they're at the framework level, these tell Angular specifically how to wire itself together. And so one is language, which is ES6, and then on top of that, you have ng module, which then tells Angular, like, okay, in order for this to run, you have these dependencies, and you have these particular components that we need to declare, as well as, let me go one module over here. So you'll notice even in my routes, it's recommended that you actually segment that into a standalone module. And you'll see here that in the imports line, so I believe it's 4 lines from the bottom, is I am importing my routes into this module so it can be wired up by Angular, but I'm doing this by calling a method. And so I'm saying I want to attach these routes to essentially the root injector and make this available. And so this is specific to Angular. When you see something like, some module for root or for child, that is specifically for Angular and how it assembles itself at runtime in order for it to work. So they're similar in terms of terminology. It's a bit overloaded, but they do 2 totally separate things. So language level organization, framework level organization. So the question is, what type of route would somebody lazy load? And the answer to that is possibly a route that does not get a lot of traffic. So when you don't lazy load your routes, that everything gets compiled into like one bundle that gets deployed. That makes the initial payload a lot bigger. So let's say 80% of your application traffic is within like 1 or 2 modules. So you might want to load those up front to allow for a quicker load time. But then let's say once in a while, somebody actually does go and read your terms and conditions on your website. So that's actually a great one, is that if you, let's say you have, some terms and conditions or something that most people are not going to go to, but they need to be able to. And so you would load that lazily. So it's essentially on demand versus we're just going to load everything up front preemptively.